Good morning, and thank you for being here. Today, I would like to discuss the concept of genius loci, or what we commonly understand as spirit of place, and explore how this concept might be reconsidered in the context of contemporary digital technologies. The idea of genius loci has been highly influential within architecture, urban design, and heritage conservation because it helps us understand how places acquire identity, meaning, and sense of belonging. However, we are living in a period where our encounters with place are increasingly mediated through photographs, social media, virtual tours, digital archives, and immersive technologies. Many of our first impressions of places may now occur through screens rather than through direct physical experiences. This presentation asks whether the spirit of place can survive under these conditions and proposes a new way of understanding genius loci through three interconnected dimensions: perception, memory, and mediation. I will argue that genius loci has not disappeared in the digital age. Rather, it has become a more dynamic process that emerges through interaction between people, places, memory, and technology. Let me begin with a simple question. Can the spirit of place survive the digital age? For much of the 20th century, our understanding of place was grounded in physical presence. We traveled to places, walked through streets and buildings, touched materials, heard sounds, and experienced atmospheres. Through these direct encounters, places acquired meaning, identity, and memory. This understanding is reflected in the concept of genius loci, which Christian Norberg Schultz described as the spirit of place, the unique character that allows people to orient themselves, belong, and dwell meaningfully within an environment. Today, however, the way we encounter places is changing. Increasingly, we experience places through photographs, social media, and digital archives, Google Street View, virtual tours, and immersive technologies. For many people, the first encounter with a place now happens through a screen rather through direct physical experience. This shift raises an important question. Is our experience of place, if our experience of place is increasingly shaped by representation rather than direct encounters, what happens to genius loci? Does the spirit of place remain tied to the physical presence, or can it also emerge through memory, perception, and digital representation? This question is particularly relevant for heritage, where digital technologies are becoming central tools for documentation, interpretation, and public engagement. Understanding how these technologies influence our relationship with place is therefore essential for rethinking the meaning of the genius loci today. To explore whether genius loci can survive the digital age, we first need to understand how the concept has been traditionally understood. The concept of genius loci is mostly associated with the work of Christian Norberg Schultz, who drew on phenomenology to explain how people relate to their surroundings. For Norberg Schultz, genius loci refers to a spirit of place, the distinctive character that makes one place different from another and gives people a sense of identity, orientation, and belonging. A place is therefore more than its physical form. It is not simply a collection of buildings, streets, or landscapes, but sometimes something that acquires meaning through human experience. Central to his argument is the idea of dwelling. People do not merely occupy spaces, they engage with it, interpret it, and develop emotional connections to it. Through this relationship, places become meaningful and develops its own identity. This understanding has been extremely influential within architecture, urban design, and heritage conservation. Many conservation approaches continue to assume that places possess a distinctive character that should be identified, protected, and transmitted to future generations. However, embedded within this perspective is an important assumption. the assumption that the spirit of place exists as a relative stable quality rooted in physical environment and accessible through direct experience. The question I would like to raise is whether this assumption still holds today. If our understanding of place is shaped not only by physical encounters but also memory, interpretation, media, and digital technologies, can genius loci still be understood as something fixed within a place itself? Or it is something that is continuously constructed and reconstructed through our relationship with the place? In the traditional understanding of genius loci, assumes that place is experienced primarily through direct physical encounter, we must ask whether this assumption still reflects contemporary reality. Today, our relationship with places is increasingly mediated. We explore cities through Google Street View, visit heritage sites through virtual tours, and engage with places through social media, digital archives, and immersive technologies. In many cases, our first experience of a place occurs through its representation rather than the physical presence. At the same time, developments in cognitive science and memory studies challenge the idea that perception is a passive process. Researchers such as Lisa Feldman Barrett suggest that perception is shaped by previous experience, expectations, and cultural frameworks. Similarly, memory is now understood not as a fixed record of past, but as something that is continuously reconstructed and reinterpreted. Together, these developments suggest that our experience of place is shaped not only by the physical environment itself, but by how we perceive it, remember it, and represent it. This raises an important challenge for the traditional concept of genius loci. If place is increasingly encountered through mediation and interpretative processes, can the spirit of place still be understood as a stable quality embedded within the environment? Or should it be understood as something that emerges through interaction between people, memory, perception, and representation? Having established why traditional understanding of genius loci needs to be reconsidered, I would now like to introduce the conceptual framework that structures this research. The framework is built around three interconnected dimensions, namely perception, memory, and mediation. These dimensions were selected because they represent the key processes through which places are experienced, understood, and communicated in contemporary societies. The first dimension is perception. As before a place can acquire meaning, it must be first experienced. However, perception is not simply the reception of sensory information, it is an active process through which individuals construct meaning from their surroundings. The second dimension is memory. Places are never experienced in isolation from the past. Individual memories, collective memories, and cultural narratives influence how places are understood and valued. Memory, therefore, provides the temporal dimension through which places acquire continuity and significance. The third dimension is mediation. As increasingly our understanding of place is shaped by representation, whether through photographs, film, archives, social media, virtual reality, or digital reconstruction, these forms of mediation influence how places are communicated, interpreted, and remembered. Rather than viewing the physical environment, this framework proposes that it emerges through continuous interaction of these processes. We perceive places through embodied experience, we interpret it through memory, and we increasingly encounter it through mediated representations. From this perspective, genius loci is not a static essence waiting to be discovered, but is a dynamic and evolving construct that is continuously produced through relationship between people, places, memory, and technology. The first dimension, I'll go back to it, is perception. Traditionally, Discussion of genius loci often assume that the spirit of place exists within the environment and that people simply perceive it. However, phenomenological approaches suggest a more complex relationship between people and places. Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that perception is not a passive reception of sensory information. Rather, it is an active process through which meaning is created. We do not experience places as detached observers. We experience them through our bodies, movement, touch, sound, light, texture, scale, and atmosphere all contribute to how a place is understood and interpreted. In other words, places are not merely seen, places are lived. For example, when walking through a historic street, our experience is shaped not only by what we see, but also by the sound of footsteps, the texture of materials, changing light conditions, temperature, and even pace at which we move through space. These sensory experiences contribute to the meaning we attribute to a place. Contemporary cognitive theory further develops this argument. Lisa Feldman Barrett suggests that the perception is shaped by previous experiences, expectations, and cultural knowledge. In other words, we do not simply receive information from the world around us, but our brains actively interpret what we are experiencing. As a result, two individuals may encounter the same place and experience it differently. A resident, a tourist, an architect, and a historian may all perceive the same environment through different memories, expectations, and frames of references. This has an important implication for genius loci. If perception itself is interpretative, then the spirit of place cannot be understood solely as an objective quality embedded within physical environment. Rather, it emerges through the relationship between the observer and the place is being experienced. From this perspective, genius loci is not something we simply discover. It's something we continuously construct through embodied experience and interpretation. The second dimension of the framework is memory. If perception explains how we experience place, memory helps explain how places acquire meaning over time. Traditional memory was often understood as a relatively stable record of the past. However, contemporary memory studies challenge this assumption. Scholars such as Paul Requa, Aleida Assmann, and David Lowenthal argue that memory is not simply stored and retrieved. Rather, it is selective, fluid, and continuously reconstructed. In other words, we do not remember the past exactly as it happened. We reinterpret it through the lens of present experience, values, and concerns. This has an important implication for how we understand the place. Places are not static containers of meaning, they are significant changes as memory change. A building, a street, or a landscape may carry different meanings for different generations because each generation interprets the past differently. Memory, therefore, adds a temporal dimension to genius loci. The spirit of place is not shaped solely by what exists physically in the present, but also how the places are remembered and narrated over time. This applies both to individual and collective memory. At an individual level, personal experiences create emotional attachments to places, and at a collective level, communities create shared narratives that contribute to identity and belonging. These narratives often become embedded within particular places. Pierre Nora describes such places as sites of memory. These are places where history, identity, and collective remembrance become anchored in the physical environment. From this perspective, genius loci cannot be understood solely through architecture, urban form, or landscape. It also emerges through the stories people tell, the memories they preserve, and the meanings they attach to places. The spirit of place, therefore, exists not only in the material environment, but also in the memories, narratives that continually reinterpret it. The third dimension of the framework is mediation. If perception explains how we experience places and memory explains how we remember it, mediation helps us understand how places increasingly communicated, interpreted, and encountered through representation. Today, our relationship with places is shaped by an expanding range of digital technologies. We explore cities through Google Street View, visit museums through virtual tours, encounter heritage through social media, and experience reconstructed environments through virtual and augmented reality. As a result, many people form impression of places before ever physically visiting them. In some cases, a digital encounter becomes the primary encounter. To understand this phenomenon, I draw on Alison Landsberg's concept of prosthetic memory. Landsberg argues that people develop meaningful and emotional connections to event histories and places that they have never directly experienced. Through films, digital archives, virtual reconstruction, and immersive environments, individuals can engage with places across spatial and temporal boundaries. A person can feel connected to a historic site, a city, or a cultural landscape without ever having physically been there. This has a significant implication for heritage. Digital technologies expand access, support education, and enable new forms of participation. They allow heritage narratives to reach audiences far beyond the physical boundaries of a site. However, mediation is not simply a neutral channel through which information passes. The places we encounter through a screen is not identical to the place encountered physically. What we experience is a representation, a version of a place shaped by technological choices, cultural narratives, institutional priorities, and increasingly by digital platforms and algorithms. In this sense, mediation does not merely communicate genius loci, it actively participates in its construction. The spirit of place is therefore no longer produced only through direct experiences and memory, but also through images, narratives, and representations that circulate through digital media. The shift this shifts our understanding of genius loci from something that resides solely in physical environment to something that is continuously negotiated between experience, memory, and representation. Yet, reconsidering the growing role of digital mm, mediation does not mean that digital experience can fully replace physical experience. This brings us to the limitation of digital engagement with places. Before having discussed the opportunities created by digital mediation, it is equally important to acknowledge its limitations. Digital technologies have transformed access to heritage. They allow us to visit sites remotely, explore environments that no longer exist, and engage with places that may not be geographically distant or physically inaccessible. However, digital experience is not equivalent to lived experience. Juhani Palasma reminds us that architecture is fundamentally multisensory. We do not experience places through vision alone. We experience them through touch, sound, smell, temperature, materiality, and atmosphere. These sensory dimensions contribute to how places are perceived, remembered, and ultimately how meaning is formed. While digital technologies can reproduce visual appearance with increasing accuracy, they cannot fully replicate embodied presence. A virtual reconstruction may allow us to see a historic street, but it cannot fully communicate the texture of stone under our feet, the smell of materials, changing temperatures, or the subtle atmospheric qualities that shape our experience of place. This limitation is also important from a cognitive perspective. As discussed earlier, perception emerges through interaction between body and environment. Physical engagement, important dimensions of experience remain Without physical engagement, important dimensions of experience remained absent. This does not mean that digital technologies are inadequate or unimportant. On the contrary, they play an essential role in documentation, education, interpretation, and accessibility. However, they should be understood as augmentative rather than substitutive. Digital heritage expands access and enriches interpretation, but it cannot fully replace the embodied and multisensory engagement through which genius loci is experienced. Therefore, rather than viewing digital and physical experience as competing alternatives, I suggest they should be understood as complementary layers through which the spirit of place can be explored, interpreted, and communicated. To conclude, I would like to return to the question which I began. Can the spirit of place survive the digital age? My argument is that it can, but not in the way it has traditionally been understood. Throughout this presentation, I have suggested that genius loci should no longer be viewed as a fixed essence residing within the physical fabric or place. Instead, it emerges through interaction of three interconnected processes, namely perception, memory, and mediation. Perception reminds us that place is experienced through body and interpreted through lived experience. Memory reminds us places are continually reconstructed through personal recollection, collective narratives, and cultural meanings. Mediation reminds us that digital technologies increasingly shape places, how places are encountered, communicated, and remembered. Taken together, these perspectives suggest that the spirit of place is not something static waiting to be discovered. Rather, it is something continuously produced and reproduced through the relationship between people and places. Digital technologies, therefore, do not signal the end of genius loci, nor do they simply replicate it. Instead, they transform the conditions through which it is perceived, remembered, and constructed. From architecture and heritage practice, this has an important implication. The challenge is not to choose between physical and digital experience. The challenge is to understand how they interact in the ongoing production of meaning. Perhaps then the spirit of place is not located solely within the place itself, but within evolving relationship between body, memory, narrative, and technology. I would like to finish with a final thought. The spirit of place survives the digital age, not because it remains unchanged, but because it continually adopts to new ways of being perceived, remembered, and represented. Thank you for showing interest in this presentation. Thank you.